The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's MWF webinar. My name is Natalie. I am a technical specialist over here at Struxoft Solutions. And if this is your first webinar with us, let me just tell you a little bit about what we do. Our principal software, MWF, which this stands for Metal Wood Framer, is our Revit wall, floor, ceiling and truss framing tool for light gauge steel and wood modelling. Today, Anesu is going to be presenting our webinar, and he is a technical specialist. He'll be walking us through the first part of our MWF miscellaneous properties series. This session is going to cover some of the options in the miscellaneous tab, in the properties tab, including stud and track settings, placing extra studs, opening framing, and horizontals. Before we start, I just want to go over just a few general items about the webinar. At the end of the webinar, we will be taking a few live questions. If you want to be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel, just under the attendees tab, and please make sure that your computer audio is working. If you prefer, you can also type some questions through the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. I will try and answer some of these during the webinar. So that's it from me, and I will hand you over to Anesu now.
Hello, thank you very much, Natalie. I'll just go ahead and start sharing my screen. There we go. Yeah, and I'll just move my dashboard tool over to my other page. So hello, as Natalie said, I'm a technical specialist as well, working here in the Liverpool office. Today we're going to be covering part one of the two-part series, as she's outlined, regarding some key features within our panel properties, more specifically our miscellaneous tab. So the way this webinar is going to go about, we're going to be using this house model we have over here, and we're just going to start framing our ground floor with our timber examples using the internal and our LGS examples using the external. Over here we can see the topics we're going to be covering. We're going to be working with 8 different panels. Some of them will have 2 functions carried out on them, as you can see. But we'll just try and run through a couple scenarios that you can face within your modeling and how you can utilize these properties. So without further ado, we can just go ahead and get started. So as you can see here, we have all of our architectural walls lined up here. We're going to start by just highlighting all the walls on this face, just to save creating all these panels one by one. So I have all my walls selected. Just loading my create tab. And if you're familiar with MWF, you're aware we can create templates and save them for reuse on other panels. I've just created a template here before the webinar began, and I'm just going to apply it to these 4 walls. And that's complete. So we'll start here with number 1, which is going to be covering studs and panel direction. So if I just go to a view that makes it a bit clearer to see what is going on. Sorry as well, just to be aware of any confusion that may be going on with this extension here. This is because this is cutting off at the architectural wall here, and that little overlap is just the join there. So it's not that the panel is extending for no reason. But essentially, yeah, we can just go ahead and get started on studs first of all. So if I have my wall highlighted, or any member associated to that wall, I can go ahead to my single layer properties. And actually within the properties, we have the ability to alter the stud spacing as well as the first stud offset. So if I go to my structural tab here, I can see here that I have my first stud offset set to 400. That's the value I decided to save into my template. However, of course, I can change it afterwards. Over here at the top in our miscellaneous, the first feature we'll look at is studs. And if you click that, you're presented with this window here. So in panel properties, I'm able to change the value of my stud spacing by simply highlighting in and just changing the value. So let's say, for instance, I wanted a spacing of 300. I can just go ahead and press OK. And you can see now my panel has regenerated with that spacing. However, of course, keeping that 400 first stud offset initially. If we wanted to change our spacing in another way, perhaps, we have the options here available to do that. We can associate this. Oh, sorry. We can associate this template to a benchmark that we have in our project. We also have the ability to work with the parameters that we set in a wall. So I've actually made one instance-based and one type-based. So for example, with an instance-based, I've actually added a parameter here, and I've chosen to put a value of 200, just so I can show a bit of a differentiation. So if I select my stud spacing, let's just move it here so you can see the alteration a bit easier. And you can see here now that my spacing has adjusted in accordance to that instance-based parameter. You can also incorporate type-based parameters so that you have specific spacings for specific wall types. So my basic wall, I've actually added a type parameter. If I just drag it over here, and it's underneath my dimensions option. So I've chosen to add a 600 spacing in my basic wall external 100 mils. So every wall with this, every wall family of this wall, sorry, will have this parameter placed in it. So if I go back to my spacing, I can actually alter my spacing as well through the type parameter that I've created here. Simply press close and then OK. And we can see now that it's shifted to have a 600 spacing. So there's multiple ways you can go about deciding to space your panels. It's entirely up to you, really. The option just below it now we're going to be looking at is panel direction. So we've seen how we can space out our panels, but now we're going to look at how we can actually dictate the direction of the starting point of said panel and which way the members are going to be running to. So if we look here, we have this drop down which gives us three options, well essentially two options, because the default is actually left when looking from the interior. If we wanted to alter that direction, we can simply just use this option below, and that will rearrange our studs to start from the opposite direction. Below here, we actually have this tick box we can highlight called Use Locator, and this essentially just applies some nodes that gives us an indication of where the starting points of our panel is. So if I just go ahead and press close and press OK, the panel has now changed its starting point. So the starting point is now altered to this side, and we can tell that by the nodes that we have visible here as well. And even if we look in our plan view, I can go ahead to my panel here that I was working on and just select into it. And you can actually see there's an arrow now dictating the direction in which the panel is running. So that's just a quick look at how we can alter our stud spacing, as well as add more control to our panel direction. We're going to move on now to our second panel. And in here, we're going to be covering tracks as well as end studs. So if I go ahead and go back into my properties, and we're just going to move this side and select tracks. So within tracks, we have options available to us, such as adding a deflection top gap to our panel, so we can have some form of tolerance at the top. So I could perhaps put in 20, apologies for anybody using Imperial. It's just a bit easier for me to translate in metric. But if I was to put 20 mil at the top, for instance, that would now allow me to have a gap at the top over here. I don't even necessarily have to keep my tracks. I have the option to also disable my top, either my top or bottom track, or even both if I see fit. But we're just going to leave them as they are for now. Below that, we have an add vertical to staggered bottom. So we can actually see here we have a little opening at the bottom of our panel. Let's say, for instance, you had some hatch or a fixing that needed access around this area, and you applied this opening there. You can see here that the members are actually working around the opening, adding like these full-length king studs around it. If we just wanted it to solely frame around the opening and continue the spacing that we desire in our template, for instance, in this one, I have 400. I can go ahead and do that by adding vertical stagger to my bottom. I can choose to alter the family I'm going to use for these verticals, but I'll just keep it the same to maintain some uniformness in my panel. And just below that, we also have the option to override our justification in our track. So we can actually choose to move our track away from the structural center line, which it currently rests at, and we have these options available to us. I'll keep it a structural center line for now. We'll look into saddle notches just after I generate this panel. But if I go ahead and press OK, and OK again, we can see here now that the opening has been reworked around so that the members just solely frame around it, maintaining our 400 spacing, exempt to this area, of course, which I'm using some join markers to have a better interaction between my internal walls and my external walls. And you can just see here on the side as well, we have our 20 mil gap that we've chosen to apply at the top of our panel as well. So in regards to saddle notches, which you saw at the bottom, we're actually going to use one of our internal timbers as an example for this. So if I go ahead and select this panel here, I'm going to go into my properties, and I'd like to add a saddle notch to this panel. So if I just find Trex. So we can simply do this by just ticking the box initially to OK adding a notch to this panel. We can choose the family we would like to apply to this panel as well. I'm going to choose my 38 by 114, sorry, just to make that area a bit bigger. And we can actually dictate whether it is going to be resting in the internal or the exterior. As simple as that, really. If you tick the box, select your family, choose your reference it's going to be landing on, you can simply press OK, and then OK again. And my panel will regenerate with that saddle notch placed at the top. Now, these saddle notches could actually be useful for your external walls, for instance, where the walls would meet up with the floors. This would create a much larger area for things such as nailing and connections around this area. So this feature can actually prove to be very beneficial. If I go back now to my tracks, just an area as well that is not often known about within the miscellaneous tab within your property alterations. You actually have this manufacturer option adjacent to these edit buttons. So some of these would actually not have any manufacturer variations to them. However, some of them do. For instance, here we have it on tracks. If I just select nested track and I just go ahead and click into that, we're given this window here where we can actually make some alterations to our tracks. So we can actually have a nested track as the one I've selected here, and we can choose certain families we'd like to apply. So and as presumably you'd have one family bigger here and one family smaller here, and you can dictate the offsets in which you want these to be spaced apart. So there's some variations that you can apply to some of these edits. Some of these are, of course, based off of manufacturers, and some of these are actually functions that have been requested by clients using the software. So the second thing we were going to outline in this panel was end studs. So if I go ahead and select that, we can go ahead by firstly initially choosing to override the general. So I can actually make sure that my members match with my panel template. so I had C100s. However, I would like to have a different family to that I have inside my panel, so I am going to use this N stud family that I've duplicated here, and just apply them to both of those. We have the opportunity to rotate the angle of these N studs if we see fit. So if we added a 90-degree rotation, that member would come in horizontally sideways. Below that to the left, we actually have some elevation options here where we can dictate the elevation of these said end studs. If we, for instance, applied a negative value onto one of these, we could actually cut inwards to the panel. If we applied a positive one, it could actually protrude out through the tracks. And to the side here, we also have our repeats for our start studs and our end studs. So initially it may be a little confusing because if we have 0 here, that would indicate that we have 1 end stud. If we were to add 1, that means we would have 2 studs at the end of our panel. So it may be a bit confusing initially, but 0 would be 1 and 1 would be 2. So if I just go ahead and add 1 on one side and leave 2, have 2 on one side and leave 1 on the other, I press close and then I press OK. And we can see here now that we have our end studs applied to our panel. So this family that I'm using here has these kind of square cutouts at the top of them with these little notches on this side. So there's some ways we can actually go about adjusting our tracks as we've just outlined, as well as having some more bespoke configuration to our end studs as well. Moving on now, we're going to be covering opening framing. For those of you who are familiar with the software, you may be aware that you can actually edit your openings using the opening marker and apply opening type. So this can give you quite a wider range of options you can do to your openings. But you can also apply some adjustments to your openings in the Properties tab as well. So the way this wall differs from our other walls, I've actually used Revit splits on the other panels, which you may be familiar with. However, in this one, I've decided to use our MWF break horizontal marker. So when I place this in my architectural wall, it keeps it pretty, keeps it looking aesthetically the way we want it. However, once we create a panel, we have that split that tells us that we want a panel on this side and a panel on this side, and they should be treated independently. So I'm going to go ahead and create said panels, and I'm just going to show you how we can make edits to those two different panels simultaneously by selecting the wall. So now that I've got that made, I have my panel 13 and I have my panel 14 over here. So the changes I'm going to be looking at these and wanting to make, I'm going to be looking to add a tolerance to my opening over here and maybe add a sill and a king. And for my door on panel 13, I'm going to go ahead and add an extra header and add some jacks on this side. So a way I can actually edit the properties of these both at once is by simply selecting the wall that they were created in and going to properties. And you can see on the top left here that I have panel 13 and panel 14 in my options. So we're going to start with panel 13 on this side. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my miscellaneous and opening framing. And the window that we're presented with here actually shows us some 3 tick boxes we can choose from at the top. So if I were to use settings from opening tab, this would actually be from over here, which we're going to look into. If we were going to use opening mapping rule sets, we can actually create a rule set here and select it from the drop-down. And if we were to use opening framing condition, we would actually be using the markers that come loaded in to the through MWF, and we'd be able to apply specific opening markers to certain situations, e.g., like a door with an adjacent window, for example. General on the far side, we can actually use rough dimensions available. So if you wanted to frame around the rough dimensions of your wall instead, you can go about doing that by selecting that tick box there. So if I go back here now to my opening framing, I've got this selected. I'll just use that. The option that we're going to be working on is a door. However, we can choose to have any settings that we put in be recognized by all the openings available. Or alternatively, we can switch between independent situations within our panel. So if I select doors, now I'm going to be focusing on the opening I have here. I'm going to neglect the tolerances for now because I'll be applying that to my window. Just below that, we have the opportunity to select different family sizes in our opening, and we also have the ability to have a alignment selected as well. If we wanted to add additional members, such as what we're trying to do, I can go ahead and click this drop down, and I'm going to select a header, and I'm going to go ahead and add that. You can invert it beforehand, of course, or you can actually invert it after as well. I'm going to add it, and we have the option here to invert or delete any of the additions that we add. However, the original header 1, king 1, and sill 1, they actually have to stay in the settings in order to actually create an opening. So I'm going to keep header 1 standard as it is without an inversion, and I'm going to add an extra jack. Just apply that there. And I'm happy with the two options I've put in, so I'm going to go ahead and press close. And I'm going to apply the changes I've made to panel 13. Now moving on to panel 14, I'm going to be working on my window now. So if I go ahead and kind of go through the same process, however, this time we're going to be adding a tolerance. So I'm going to add 10 mil around my opening. Just select that. I'm going to keep the families the same as well. But this time I'm going to make some different selections. So I'm going to be adding a sill, and I'm going to be inverting that. And I'm going to be adding a king, and I'm just going to leave that standard. So if I'm happy with that as well, I'll just press apply. And once I'm done with all my changes, I can go ahead and press OK. And now my wall has adjusted. So if I just temporarily hide the wall, we can see here now that I have two sills applied to my window, as well as having two kings here on either side. I also, on my door, have the adjustments that I requested. So I have my two headers, as well as my two jacks applied as well. And if I just go and unhide the wall, you can actually see here now that I have my 10 mil tolerance around my opening before the framing has actually begun to be applied. So that's just a look at some quick changes we can actually make to our openings within the properties features. Moving on now, we're going to be looking at bearings. So if I just rotate that round. So if we wanted to, for instance, add a bearing to our panel, we can actually go about doing that within the properties as well. So in this option just below, we can just click edit. And I just stretch that out a little bit. We have the ability to have a type configuration here below. So the diagram that you can see, the colorful diagram here you can see adjacent, is actually reflected by the type configuration you select. So at the minute it's displaying type A. If we were to select type B and just click away, it would adjust that image, as well as type C. If we just click away, it would also adjust that image. So we're going to be using type A as an example for the bearing we're trying to apply. Above here, we can actually select specific members we would like to have in correlation to the options available. You can see here in the image. So for my beam brace here, I think I'd like to add some C100s. For my cripples here, I'm going to add C100 if I choose to enable them. For my plate, I will keep it the same as it is. And for my beam track, I will change that to a U100. So if I'm happy with all of the members that I've chosen to select, I can now begin to go down here and select what I want to keep in my panel and what I don't want to keep. So if I go ahead and select enable beam angle, I'll leave the plate unticked. I can choose certain references this is going to be applied to, so top of opening, exterior. I'm going to leave my beam cripple unticked. However, I'm going to select centered. If I'm happy with all the information that's been applied here, I can go ahead now to the left here and actually dictate where this bearing is actually going to be applied. So if I said the whole panel, my bearing would actually be applied at the top of my panel itself. If I said all spans, I believe it would go to all spans with all of the openings within that panel. And if I just click a specific span, at the minute I only have one span in here, one opening in here, so I could take a wild guess and assume it's this one. I can go ahead and take that off, close, and press OK. And now I have my bearing actually applied to my window opening. So you can see here we have our bearing with my U100 tracks as well as my C100s in the inside. Just to get another view of this in the section, we can actually see it here now with the braces in the middle here and then the tracks at the top and the bottom. So that's how we can go about adding a bearing to our openings or panels itself, if you prefer, through the properties. Moving on now, we're going to be looking at the structural members option. So if I just go ahead and select my wall, I'm going to head back into my miscellaneous, and we're going to make this selection here on our structural members option. So within the structural members, we can actually make quite a number of changes within our panel with this one feature. So the first thing we can even look at is just a restart at openings. So for instance, if I just have this ticked here, it'll now give me access to select this settings box. And I can just drag this over here and I can pick where I would like my studs to restart from. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to restart at the first king, and I wanted to enable override on my spacing. I can go ahead and change that to 200 perhaps, and click OK. And this would actually rework my cripples around the first king to readjust them as we've applied as we have in the settings we've applied. We have on the next tab above, we have the ability to alter the stud configuration. So this can be beneficial if you're trying to have a specific stud or organization in your panel. So we can actually choose to have them normal, as you see them now at the minute. We can have double studs, we can have back-to-back, facing, interlock, or even triple. For this instance, we're going to actually have back-to-back studs. We have again here an option to associate our template, associate benchmarks to our templates and our properties as well. So you can choose from one of the reference planes here, or a benchmark that you've created yourself. We also have the ability to space our panels again, this time via zones. And in the MISC tab here, we can actually make some adjustments to our cripples in terms of the families we wish to use. So just to show a differentiation, I'm going to be using the C100s this time. And we can actually do the same configuration on our studs as we can do on our cripples as well. So I had back-to-back, I believe, on my studs. I'm going to choose face-to-face for my cripples. So if I'm happy with all of that, I can just click close, and then I can click OK. And we can see now that my panel has readjusted. We now have this this kind of visual overlap. You can see just below the track that I have my normal studs working as back-to-backs now. And in the inside here, I have my cripples set to be C70s now at a face-to-face configuration. And it's actually adjusted the spacing as well, moving these on inwards by 200 mil, as I've chosen to reset it from the first king. So that's some changes you can actually make to your studs as well as your cripples as well. Moving on to the next feature we're going to be looking at. In fact, if I just go back to my 3D, sorry, I have a lot of tabs open at the minute. We're just going to go ahead and create two of the last three panels we're going to be looking at. So you can just go ahead and click template and set this as the active, and then just create, and that's okay. So moving on now, we're going to be looking at control joint. So we can actually have some more manipulation of how our cripples are going to be landing in our panel. We can go ahead and select our wall again, go into our properties, miscellaneous, and go to our control joint. So our control joint allows us to have a little bit more manipulation on where we choose to apply and adjust our cripples. Above here, you can see the different options, different opening options. It will allow you to have some alterations in. This instance is a window, of course, so we'll just keep it ticked at that. Below, we are gonna go ahead and just place on every opening. Below that, now we can begin to choose where we're going to be applying cripples and what offsets we're going to be adding to them. So in my example here, I just like to add some cripples just above the jacks I have in my opening over here and over here. So I'm just going to tick place cripples at the top and leave the bottom one unticked. This should, if I leave my offsets unchanged, I believe they should just land on either side here. But if you had a specific instance position you wanted these to land in, you can add a positive or negative value here, of course. Any value add here laterally will actually move the cripple away from the panel along this axis here. And with the extensions here, of course, you can actually choose to add another, again, a positive or negative value to have your length of your cripple adjusted as well. Below that as well, we also have the option to add extra verticals. If we wanted to place a vertical, we can just simply tick this tick box here, choose which family we would like to add, and I believe the default value of 0 and 0 would have these placed on either side of the opening. And if you were to add a left and right offset, this will push them further or closer away from the opening as you see fit. So the changes that I've only made in this one is just to place on top cripples, place top cripples, sorry, and even place on every opening. So if I'm happy with that, I can press OK and OK again. And we can see here now that I have my cripples applied above my jacks to give the opening view that I was looking for. Moving on to the next topic here, we have a quite similar feature available in extra studs. So if I go ahead and click into this one again now. In extra studs, we actually have the ability to have more control beyond just the cripples shown in the control joint. So for instance, we can go ahead and choose a reference in which we want to read from. So if we wanted to go from the end of the panel on this side, I believe the start is on the left side here because we're looking from the interior. We can actually go ahead and change the reference. We can choose what offset we would like to have for that. So I'm going to say 450 because I have a 400 spacing, I believe, on my panel. So I can actually choose what family I would like this member to come in as. I'm going to keep it as C100 to match my template. And we can also, of course, adjust its angle to give the member itself any form of rotation we want. I'm going to go ahead and select the structural center line and select the alignment to center as well. And if we're happy with all of that, we can actually just add it in. And if we wanted to make any changes after the fact to this, we can go ahead and make our changes, have this member selected, and press update. So this is a way we can actually add new members to our panel. If we had a member that we have in our panel already that we would like to replicate, we can also do that as well. So here in this list is actually the members available in my panel at the minute. If I just move this to the side, this side perhaps. So it's still got that added. I would like to kind of follow suit with the action that I made on my prior panel on control joints. I'd like to add a cripple here and a cripple here just above my jacks. I can actually do that by selecting my cripples in question that I'm trying to replicate. So I believe this is C1 and this is C2. So if I was to select C2 and just add one and then add it to my list, and I was to select C1 and then just add one and then add it to my list. Below here, we also have options where we can shuffle between the original and the member we're actually replicating. If we wanted to, for instance, go to this one and wish to have it inverted, it would correspond that way as well, and it will land that way when we apply it to our panel. We can also add different families out of the selection we have here. That are actually families currently in the project. So if you just left it blank, it would actually replicate the default member that is being replicated. So below, as said again, you have these options to add extensions or deduct from your cripple as well, but we're just going to keep them the same as they are now. And the same applies here for the repeat and modify. If you make any changes, just select which one you were working on and simply press update. So if we're happy with all of that, we can go ahead and press close and press OK. And as you can see here now, I have my cripples applied to my opening here. So extra studs can be a very useful tool for replicating one of your existing panels. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to have a double stud configuration on a back-to-back kind of setup. You can actually just use extra studs on one of these members. For instance, this one's labeled as S1, and then just simply add another one directly next to it and invert it, and you have a back-to-back configuration for one of your members here. So that's just how we can go about using the extra studs feature on our panels. The final feature we're going to be looking at in part one is horizontals. And for horizontals, we're going to be using our timber panel here. So horizontals can be very beneficial for instances such as if we wanted to add a horizontal to align with our sheathing boards, for instance. Let's say your boards came in at a certain length and you had to have another, just a structural member there for it to land on at its center point. We can go ahead and apply that. So let's give an example of end 1 to end 2. We can justify it to the structural center line. I'm happy with the family that it's using at the minute. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to be at, let's say, 2,300. I'm aware some boards come in at 2,400 by 1,200, but let's say, for instance, you had a specific board that just wasn't quite long enough for that. We can just go ahead and add that, and then click close. And once we press OK, our horizontal now comes in at the top of our panel. Now, the reason why my horizontal has actually come in different individual sections is because I made a change prior in this template in the structural tab over here. So if we were to simply untick this split horizontal studs, we can see here now that our horizontal is actually going from N1 to N2 still, but it's just one solid piece. So I just go ahead and do that. So if you make sure you have that feature selected, it will actually split up your members, and it will invite you to have more features available to you, such as the stagger here. So we're going to go ahead and add a stagger to our horizontal as well. You're not necessarily limited to just having one horizontal per panel. So if I say N1 to N2 again, we can go ahead and have a stagger over here. Sorry, lost my trail of thought. If I have 100 here, I can go ahead and add this as a new a new definition, because I'd like to have my two situations applied. I'm just going to make sure this is halfway in the around about halfway in the panel instead this time. So I'm going to go ahead and just change the offset here, and then I can go ahead and press OK. And if I go back to my horizontal at the top of my panel here, I'm actually going to make another change as well. We noticed that my horizontal ran all the way through, even through my the top of my opening. If I wanted to make a change to that, I can actually say stop at kings, and by selecting this box, my members will begin to run from N1 to N2, but once it reaches the top of the opening, it will take a slight pause and then carry on after that. So if I update the changes that I've made, click close, as you can see here, this is the situation we were talking about. We can just click OK. And now I have my two definitions of horizontals within my panel. So I have a 100 mm stagger here, and above here I also have my horizontals applied at the top of my panel, going from N1 to N2, but just taking a break here between my opening. You're not forced to, of course, have your horizontals start from N1 and stop at N2. If you had specific instances, such as, you needed horizontals for applying some sort of shelving or cabinets behind in your wall, you can actually dictate where these horizontals would start from. So yeah, that's just a brief look at how we can go about applying horizontals to our panels. If we just go back now to our 3D, we can see here now that we have applied multiple different properties features to all 8 of our panels around the exterior, as well as this one in the interior. And I hope this gives you a good gist of how we can use some of these properties features to work around some situations we may have in our modeling using MWF. So thank you for your time. I hope this webinar was beneficial for you, and I'll now hand it back over to Natalie.
Thank you, Anesu. So it looks like we have some time for a few questions and to get them answered. If you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel, and just double check that your audio is working correctly. So while we wait for any remaining questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session is finished. As always, please feel free to share the recordings with any interested colleagues. If you have any further questions or would like to set up a one-on-one demo, we highly encourage you to reach out to us after the session has ended. Our technicians will be able to take you through how our MWF modules and extensions can benefit your next Revit project. So let's just have a little look. It doesn't look like we've got any hands raised. We've had a question during the webinar. One of them was about zones, and Nick has just asked if we can have a demonstration on the features of the zones. I think we can set that up for you like in a later in a later session. I think we're just a little bit short on time now. We also had a question about the horizontals in ESU. Do you have those going always have those going all the way through the panel, or can you have them starting at certain members?
Yeah, no. As I said, you can actually dictate where your horizontals are going to be landing, depending on your needs. So actually, if I go back to my 3D, we can use this wall over here, for example. If I go ahead and click my properties and go back to the horizontal. Apologies, actually, let me just go back and maybe select where we want them to stop and start. So we can actually say we would like it to start at end1 and stop at S2. So I can simply go into my horizontals, have that applied, S2, have the right family in there, that'll be a good start as well, and simply just add it to our definitions. So once we could close on that, you can see here it started from end1 to end2. So you can actually dictate where you want these horizontals to stop and start from. It's entirely up to you. As I said, an example that this could be used for is if you had like cabinets, for instance, that needed to be hung up upon something, you can actually just have these stop and start at certain points you wanted.
Okay, great. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. Nick, we can reach out to you a little bit later today with your I think we have one hand raised. So just Nick, we will get back to you with a video on how the zones work, 'cause it's just that's one thing you can. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so we've got one question here from Catherine. I will just unmute you.
Okay. Hi,
Hello.
thank you.
Hello.
No, it's just a quick question about like the recording. I attended another webinar with you guys, and right after it ended, I didn't get the recorder recorded, and I was wondering like, and I emailed, but I emailed like the general email that you guys have, just in case I don't receive that. Who do I email or something?
Okay. Well, you have our emails just on this cover page here, which you can see. If you just want to note those down, you should automatically get the recording of the webinar after the session has ended. If you don't, just feel free to email me or an essay.
Yeah.
Okay, to know. Okay. Okay.
Okay, great. So yeah, that's all we've got time for. If there's any questions that haven't been answered, we will make sure to get to them a little bit later today. Once again, thank you, Anesu, and big thank you to everyone who registered for the webinar. I just want to mention quickly to stay tuned. We'll be having a webinar every Wednesday for the next couple of weeks. Next week's topic is going to be our part 2 of our miscellaneous tab series, where we will have a look at bracing, adding holes to your panels, and much more. Okay, so we're now going to be ending the webinar. Thanks very much and have a great day.